Morning. Good morning and welcome, Art Basel, Miami Beach Conversations. I'm very excited to see how this goes this morning. What is the role of what is the role of museums in the age of political polarization? It's actually a very serious issue. Very grateful to welcome our moderator, Andres Santo, who is a cultural strategy consultant and an author based in New York. And I invite you all to join us in welcoming all of them. Thank you very much.
Okay. Lovely to welcome you in this new place, which kind of reminds me that maybe 8 years ago we were sort of somewhat similar location and then it was different. Anyway, it keeps changing, but I love this new setup. And I also want to say hello to all the people who will be listening to this online or digitally in the coming months. Indeed, we have a great and timely topic. What is the role of museums in a time of political polarization? As we speak, there are huge demonstrations in Paris over gas price hikes and much deeper resentment. We're just coming off of a very contentious election season here in the U.S. We've got all sorts of conflicts, within the art world, and we just thought it would be a good year to address this in some way. And we have an incredible group of speakers: Amy Sadao from the ICA at University of Pennsylvania, Franklin Sirmans from right up the street at the Pérez Art Museum. And I want to express apologies on behalf of Kehinde Feldman. She had an emergency, but the amazing Larry Wheeler has joined us, who just came off of, 24 years in Raleigh at the North Carolina Museum of Art. So it's not easy to speak out about this issue for museum directors who have to balance many constituencies. So please give them a hand for their noble and brave effort. So I'd just like to start out maybe with just a few anchoring points for this conversation. I think these are sort of axiomatic for me, but you should feel free to let me know if not. One, we are seeing a trend towards political polarization all around the world. It's not just about politics, it's about the economy, it's about society, it's about ideology, people retreating into their corners and seemingly having a harder and harder time meeting in the middle. Two, art has something to say about all this, hopefully. Three, museums, as a rule, try to serve their entire societies and communities, if they can. And four, particularly in contemporary museums or museums that show contemporary art, there's been a very pronounced trend to positioning the museum as a place of dialogue and debate, not just as a place where expensive objects are to be collected and seen. And taking a stand for institutions is challenging. It's difficult. It tests leadership. There are many different constituencies to balance in the United States, particularly when your income as an institution relies on a wide range of people who have very different viewpoints on all this. So it's not easy to balance all of this out. So what I was going to do is get us started with sort of the question of, what is the responsibility of a museum and what is the responsibility of a museum leader in this situation, and how all of this sort of plays out in, as a starting point in your own institutions, and how you're sort of adjusting to the kind of this reality that I just briefly described. And I wanted to start with Franklin because he is the sleepiest this morning, so we have to wake him up, because his amazing, incredibly successful museum is, the star of this week here in Miami. He's been here since 2015. This, of course, being a city that in many ways is emblematic of what we're talking about, the state of the recount, where the coin always lands on its edge. And he has been bringing his experience as a writer, curator, editor, thinker, and has really energized this museum at this moment, incredible birth of this institution as a place where these discussions happen. So, Franklin, how does this play out for you right here in Miami?
Well, I guess I have to think back. I can think about it in a personal way, is that the museum, when I think about the topic of today, right, and I think about the moment, and you mentioned protests in France, or I think closer to home, we think about what's happening perhaps in terms of immigration, the conversation here, or even more recently, we think about what's happening right now in Cuba in particular. So these things go in cycles, and they're always topics. They're always part of the conversation, and I think there are ebbs and flows within that conversation. For me personally, the museum space has always been a contested space, right? So I mean, I was born, late 60s. Coming into the idea that, right, when I was born, there was this idea that I didn't really have a place within that conversation. So I grew up in New York City. It was a big deal to go see Lowry Sims at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? Because she was the only one who kind of looked like you. The Studio Museum in Harlem was down the street, a museum that was set up specifically to address the fact that museums were a contested space where certain people were not meant to feel as represented. So, I don't know. I think personally, I always think of the space in that way, and one of the reasons why, aside from this being Art Basel, and I love Art Basel and all the people with it, and Mary Spirito, and you, is that why I would be here at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday after a week like this, is because I really feel like this is us, right? We came, probably many of us came into the institution because we wanted to be in a place that was contested, a place where big conversations could be had. And I think the guiding light and what to bring it forward, the way that I try to address that from here is that we are very much a place for these types of conversations. It is the utopic ideal, and you can speak about that in many different ways. In the literary sense, back to the 16th century, we are that place where debate should happen, dialogue should happen, and that people should be able to do that relatively freely, and to be inspired by art and artists to move that conversation along in a way that makes things a little bit more clear, or even, I would dare say, even more humane than other sites of debate and conversation in our world.
Well, but you've been at this for a while now. I mean, do you find it getting harder, easier, the same?
Well, it's harder because I've only been in the director position for 3 years, right? So I was head of modern and contemporary at the Manil Collection, a place where, it was built off of these types of conversations. Dominique and John de Manil leaving Europe because of war, setting up in Houston with the idea that the institution would be a place of higher conversation, of debate, of learning, of dialogue, and very purposefully he set up a chapel literally down the street, right, the Rothko Chapel, where you could even extend the conversation beyond an intellectual conversation, but one that was clearly meant to invoke spirituality and some sort of higher sense or higher calling or higher requirement or something. And then moving on to LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where, like us, we're private public. We are a partnership. The idea, even the word political, is us, right? And I've had to deal with that in specific ways in the recent past. But it is the desire to be in that space and to be a part of that conversation.
Give me an example specifically.
So last year we did an exhibition, a year-long exhibition of Cuban art from a large gift from George Pérez. And as this show was beginning to come online, we were made aware of several friends in our community who did not think that we should be showing artists who still lived in Cuba, and that we were we were supporting the government of Cuba simply by doing that. And we engaged in a really healthy extensive debate and managed to move that conversation forward so that recently we had a book party celebration about this exhibition, and it was not the same contested conversation. So clearly, in this case, dialogue, debate, open conversation worked out in a way that was favorable in the end, but there were hiccups along the way. Very specifically, we lost a significant amount of funding in the process of that conversation. So as the county museum, we received about 25% of our annual budget from the county. And our county is made up of 13 different commissioners. 7 of those commissioners believe that we should not receive $550,000 of that $4 million allotment. And you could say it was because of the show, or you could say it was because of other factors, but that happened. Eventually it was reinstated. But it was a very specific instance of how we represent ourselves. But that's also why we're here, because we wanted to be a part of a political conversation. We want to be a part of a community conversation.
Right. And then taking on the cost of that is something you have to accept. Amy, you're in a different scenario here. You were born in LA. You're working
Correction, I was born in Orange County, so for those of you from Southern California, you know the difference.
As we learned in the recent elections, there's hope for Orange County. You studied at Berkeley, and you're operating in a university environment. You do a lot of, you're engaged in this dialogue in a number of ways as a writer, lecturer, and you come really from a very political, very activist background, right? You were at Visual Aids for 10 years, where you focused on HIV and activism around that. So you really come at this with that background. So, how do you translate that commitment, that very political way of being in the art world, into your current role? And how do you see this all playing out on a campus? Campuses these days being not easy places to operate.
Really contested places, right? And so I just want to underscore what Franklin started with and proposed 2 ideas. The first is that museums were never politically neutral and are not politically neutral spaces. They're spaces, and we see this in our collecting institutions that are reinstalling their collections to acknowledge a history of exclusion, a history of white supremacy, a history of the patriarchy working. And ICA, under my tenure is a feminist, is an anti-racist, is a queer and trans-welcoming and embracing space. And I see our LaPorte Associate Curator, Kate Craxton, in the front row nodding along. So we up front acknowledge, especially since we are a very contemporary space, a non-collecting space, and a space that's seated inside an academic institution that promotes, allows, expects academic freedom, that we can go further than, and we're not saddled by a collection. So the other thing that I want to propose is that the politics that imbue our world, which are, go beyond politics of representation and identity, putting that on art itself is actually a lot to ask of art. And so it is the museum space itself, perhaps not the individual artworks or the grouping in the way a show is curated or what is written about the works or even, what the artists have to say about their works, but it's the museum space that becomes the institution that Franklin's referring to, that's the agora, right? This is the place, this is the public space. And as our chief curator at ICA, Anthony Elms, is fond of saying, this is a time in which I believe in institutions. When we hear from students and other, really engaged freedom fighter types, oh, I'm very anti-institutional, how can you work inside an institution? Really, now is the time that we're throwing down for institutions because, as we know, globally, neoliberalism is dismantling institutions and privatizing them. And so any institution that functions as a public space, and yes, ICA is at a private university, a private Ivy League university, UPenn, but we are, because of our extraordinary donors, free, and we're open to everyone. And so we and and by we, I mean the president of Penn and my entire team of colleagues, we really believe that we're the public-facing space in Philadelphia for the private university, and that we welcome the greater Philadelphia area and the world in ways that the publics could not access things like a classroom. So the two ideas there are sort of like, what can we expect from art, or what can we really put on the art itself, but also the expectations for the institutions and the necessity of supporting and upholding and building and keeping pressure on our institutions.
Yeah, and I want to get back to this issue of community and the square, but before I go there, I do have a question for you about how you position the museum, because getting flack from the right, as you have politically, perhaps.
Not the right.
Well,
Can't really say right and left here.
yeah, well, yeah, but I mean, museums are often finding themselves outspoken in an outspoken role and getting some flack for that. But in universities, they often find themselves getting attacked by the student community. For not being outspoken enough. I mean, we're living in a time of trigger warnings and, very, very tight sensibilities around political speech. So how are you navigating that?
I think that the millennials get kind of a raw deal, but
Why?
I don't know if we need to get totally into like the academic classroom setting. I live with a professor and a poet, and who had worked at Penn, who works at a really sweet, wonderful liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia, Haverford. And, it's a Quaker school. The students are amazing. They're out to change the world. Mm-hmm. They're not out to make money. They're not out to just get straight A's. They are imbued with a moral and ethical sense that they have to give back, and that if justice is going to be found, it's going to be found on their watch. Do I hear from the artists who are also professors and the writers and poets who are also teaching that the classroom has become a contested space, that there are trigger words, that there is a willingness to just say, that's about rape culture, or, oh, that Whitman poem's racist, so we're not going to talk about Walt Whitman anymore. And coming from an ethnic studies background, for me, it's like, obviously. And then what? Especially in a learning situation, in a classroom. You can't just say that and expect to stop the conversation. And those are also the kinds of words that an undergraduate might use when they haven't done the reading, or they simply don't want to do the reading.
Okay, let's not beat up on undergrads. So I want to go on to Larry. That's too easy. It's too easy, Amy, too easy. So we'll get back to that, though, because I think that that's a whole new area that's opened up for us in the last few years. But Larry, give us, I'm tempted to say, give us a sense of historical perspective, because, you've been at this really for a while. 24 years there. You've been involved in completely reinventing, repositioning this museum. This is a museum set on a very large campus. North Carolina is a different place from UPenn campus. It's a very different place from here. And, this is a guy who the Washington Post called a semi-secret museum rebel. And so you've never really pulled your punches when it came to talking out about issues. But I'm very curious over those 24 years and really a lifetime in this field, how have you seen this story evolve?
Yes, well, I've been involved in cultural leadership for almost 50 years. Most recently, almost 25 years as director of a Southern Art Museum located in Raleigh, North Carolina, which has a crazy pattern of politics over time, from progressive to very conservative, and some of the colorful personalities in politics have been elected by the people of North Carolina. So where does that put the arts, and where does it put cultural institutions in the mix of politics? In a good place, I think. I have been involved in making a place we talk about institutions, and we use the word museum. What does it mean? It means different things. It used to mean something different, I think, in the 20th century from what it has to mean in the 21st century. Museums, if they are realizing their responsibility to society, are gathering places. They are the center of community life, where they should be. And it's the place where we don't force conversations. We give a place where conversations can occur, inspired by the art that we exhibit or the art that we bring in special ways around exhibitions. But museums are not just about that anymore. While they are inviting everyone from every walk of life, from every ethnicity into the midst, they truly become a reflection of the community that we serve. What I have observed over these nearly 50 years, in my 24 years at the North Carolina Museum of Art, is that we are becoming increasingly less white. And that I see Suzanne Delahanty, and we've been struggling with this for our entire career, how to make the museum less white, less old, less all the things that mark the demographic profile of museums just really 25 years ago or 20 years ago. There's been remarkable change in not only the audience of museums, but the expectations of the audience of museums and the types of programs that we create to engage them in meaningful interaction, not only with the museum, but with each other. And today, when I go into our museum in North Carolina, it's always gratifying that I see on certain days as many black faces, Asian faces, as I see white faces. Mm-hmm. And so something has happened, as a result of it. I think it's because they feel welcome. I think everyone should feel welcome. Everybody should encounter something in their own cultural experience. That's part of our responsibility. But they encounter peace and they encounter beauty, and I see smiles on everyone's faces. Something's working there. So we don't have to beat them over the head with ideas. Mm-hmm. They come to, be a part of something beautiful and share their own ideas. The other good thing about museums that has happened in just the last 20 years is that the museums are not just about the visual arts. The museums are about cultural experiences. So what we do is we provide their music, we provide dance, we provide film, we provide experiences and new technologies, we provide food, we provide drink, we provide beautiful experiences in nature, so there's not just an interior experience, it's an experience that extends into the world beyond, so that people can understand that beauty and fulfillment through creativity in the arts is all around you all the time. But you can always come to this place and be certain that you will have the most excellent experiences inspired by the voices of artists in every medium.
Well, you paint a very hopeful and utopian picture. But I can't help but wonder, I turn on the television in the evening and I switch on one station, I see one reality, I switch to another station, another reality that don't talk to each other. Is it possible to bring society together in these places? Or maybe is our sense of how society is misleading in the media? Maybe we aren't as polarized. In fact, we're happy to gather in an institution like this. I mean, which of those two images is false of our contemporary American society, do you think? Well, in other words, it seems that we're in the, one feels, reading the news, that we have gone off into our corners and we can't talk about it to each other anymore. On the other hand, you're painting this very beautiful image of the museum as a place where everybody can come and hang out and it's okay.
Well, I don't know what they're talking about, or they're probably not talking. but they're being, they're there together.
Are you capturing the full spectrum of your community, do you think?
Yes, I truly believe that we have become a gathering place for all parts of the community. Not that everybody is there, but every sector of our community is there at some point. And we are free of charge, so we never charge admission. That also becomes a great invitation.
Amy, you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to say that people who know me are probably really tired of hearing this example, but I think that what enables museums to shoot for the utopia, of which we are all three talking of, which is our vision, which is our goal. But what is particular about museums as a forum or a plaza for publics is that when we talk to each other with people whom we don't share any space, with people whom we don't have any shared experience with, we're not talking about your grandmother and my grandmother or your grandfather and my grandfather. We're talking about that object, or we're talking about the concert that we're experiencing, or we have an opportunity to move beyond our positions and focus our attention, our shared attention, on a cultural experience. And so that gives us an opportunity. It's like that gets the party started. Like you can really have those opportunities in ways that it's like people talk in the grocery store line, and regionally people talk to strangers in different ways in this country. So of course things are polarized, and of course they seem more polarized by the media, by the news. That's not particularly new. It's different. It's a different state now.
Well, I have a question. Did you? No, I have a couple of questions I'd like us to get into a little deeper, but I think we've established a few things. I think it's really good reminders here. Museums have always been contested places, that there are risks and costs for an institution to engage deeply, but also great advantages, and that we've come a very long way, and that the museum is a moving target. All of this for you guys are in the hot seat. It's about leadership, and you've already mentioned one tough moment for you, Franklin, but I'm curious for each of you, if you could reflect a bit on a situation in this space that we're discussing that was a particularly challenging moment for you, where you had to make a tough decision around this intersection of political life or kind of like what Franklin was saying. Because, it's not easy these days for a museum director. Look at what just happened at the Whitney. Right? You have a trustee of the Whitney Museum who owns a company that manufactures a product that is used to disperse people at the border. Then there's a letter campaign written by employees who are understandably upset, and now a communication has to be made. I'm just asking for each of you to reflect on perhaps a moment that was similarly very challenging for you, and how do you lead in these situations?
Well, I'll reflect on a recent one. The legislature of North Carolina passed the bathroom bill, HB2, that got a lot of national attention, in which they said that you could only go in a bathroom or a locker room of your own gender, and that meant that transsexuals, et cetera, were not allowed to go to the bathroom of their choice, and money was taken away from institutions who violated that principle. And of course, museums, our position was that we welcome everyone. We do not tell people, we do not control their behavior, and they're welcome to use the bathrooms of their choice. So we never really enforced that, nor did we have a great performing arts program in the summertime and the outdoors, and the performers were canceling their contracts in North Carolina across the board. At the symphony, artists refused to appear. At the museum, there was they would demand to have a platform to voice their opposition to HB2. So it became a big national platform for these issues. Our position was that people can say what they please, whether we get state money or not, and there was a lot of surveillance by state legislators and the state political machinery to assure that we complied. My position was, we are nonpartisan, we are non-political, we're not supporting this position, and they can do what they damn well please, but we are defending the right of everyone to speak freely. Mm-hmm. And so we allowed performers to say what they wanted to say. The symphony did not. Mm-hmm. And I felt that we rose to the better side of the leadership equation by saying that we support First Amendment rights, artistic freedom, and this is the place where you can be assured that your voice can be heard.
Franklin, did you have another example of some tricky situation you've had to negotiate as a director? Or is it all just a cakewalk for you?
Oh, it's not a cakewalk. You know that. No, I mean, I think we've all dealt with in the last, if you want to be more topical, I mean, in the last couple of years, I think the conversation has been there to be had. I've had staff challenge us on, issues around immigration. What would be our stance if ICE were to come to the museum? And we've had different opinions on that, but as far as my leadership role, as I see it, is, we're public-private, we have a board behind us, and I think, like Larry, we strive to do what we think is just, with the idea that we believe in freedom of speech, we believe that people should have a certain level of protection. So that was one instance. I think, in general, a lot of institutions, and we certainly did, was that, after the election and some of the vitriol that was part of the election process 2 years ago, that we felt the need to perhaps say that, just to say something. Mm-hmm. We sent an email immediately after just saying, we're here for everybody. We're not a part of that kind of conversation. Mm-hmm. We're here for everybody to try and dialogue and to use art as inspiration in that dialogue, in that conversation, but that we are definitely identify ourselves as a safe and open place.
Right. I mean, in fact, I think a lot of people want to get away from all that to the museum, that, kind of a quiet zone where they can escape the incredibly intensity of public life today. Amy, what about for you?
Dr. Dorothy Roberts just told me that when I was taking her through our exhibitions. She said, wow, I haven't thought about the State of the Union for the last 40 minutes. Thank you. Two examples that I'm thinking of are really specific, and they actually come perhaps more from a progressive or contentious around identity. So when Nayland Blake curated our last Keith and Kathy Sachs artist-curated exhibition, they worked with Kate Craxton as the receiving curator, and Nayland and Kate purposely used gender-neutral pronouns for all of the artists in the exhibition, regardless of whether the artist used he or she. So everyone was referred to as they or by their name. And Kate was approached by, I'm telling your story, Kate, sorry. Kate was approached by a really, like somebody very close to the museum who's a feminist curator and a queer curator who was very upset that had misunderstood, believing that the museum, that ICA was only going to use they, them for all artists, and that was erasing women. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is an argument that's happening across multiple disciplines. What did you do? Well, it was specific to this exhibition, and that's what was explained.
Oh, I see.
But it's an interesting door, that kind of swings both ways.
And, there is another interesting thing that's a new phenomenon, that, which is that some of these conflicts are playing out in real time, super fast, because of the internet. So if you think of some of the recent controversies, which I think have landed directors in tough situations, the animal pieces in the China show at the Guggenheim, the work in the Whitney Biennial, which lots of people wanted taken down. You're seeing tens of thousands of people petitioning the museum and demanding action, very often very categorical action. Take the piece away, shut the show down, not a lot of tolerance. I'm curious what your thinking is. Maybe you haven't been specifically in one of these situations, but I'm sure you follow them closely. What is a museum, what is an institution to do when this sort of swarm happens?
Well, I had one of those incidents. Several years ago, we were fortunate enough to be able to acquire a great Kehinde Wiley painting. It was his first series featuring women. And we bought the Judith and Holofernes, which was, I thought, the major painting in that particular show at Sean Kelly. And we were given, the first choice. And so I went to the show, and my curators had chosen something else. And I went and I saw this fabulous painting, and I called my curator and I said, Linda, this is the best painting in the show. We just have to have it. She says, you might look at that painting again through the eyes of the legislators in North Carolina and the docents and others who have to represent that painting. I said, I am. She says, you realize it's a black woman holding the head of a white woman. I said, cool, good. I said, it's still the best painting. And she says, and I will stand behind it. She says, we'll go for it. So we acquired the painting, it entered the collection, and there was very little controversy about it. Some of the, you teach the docents that it's, from the Book of Judith, and it's biblical, and all the other interesting storytelling devices that you build around something like that. And I think it's always, if anything is controversial, it has stories to tell.
Right,
and how do you tell those stories?
Right, but controversies have been around for a while, but very large groups of your own constituents saying, take this painting down, or, this is unacceptable. There's sort of a change.
I didn't quite finish my story. Because
I'm sorry, there's a moral to the story.
Because we did have it up, and then the great Kehinde exhibition happened, and so we lent the painting for, how long was it? 2 years, 2.5 years, it traveled around the world. And it was not in the museum. When it reappeared in the museum, it was almost at the time that Obama's portrait was done by Kehinde Wiley, and the interest in that was high, and all of a sudden people realized that we had this painting. And then because of the preponderance of social media, all of a sudden there became this right-wing buzz that the museum had this painting. It was terrible. We should take it down. Legislators got involved and said we should take it down. Other people said we should move it. Some board people said, maybe this is not the right time. I said, bullshit. I'm not moving that painting. And there are stories to tell. And it's a powerful painting. It's one of the great paintings, I think, of our age. And it's been celebrated throughout the world and seen throughout the world. And we should be proud of that. And so it's still there, hanging proudly. But I think that it is going to generate, anything like that can generate political conversation, and that's what I considered it to be. But I'm not going to be intimidated by people who
so you're
tweet
holding
the
tight.
opposition.
Franklin.
So we, as Larry mentioned, it's not just about the art that you're showing, it's about the museum experience. And the shop is a part of that, food is a part of that. We had a small paper model from a series of historical figures, right? So Mona Lisa, one of them was Kennedy. And unfortunately for me, because I did not realize it, but one of them was Fidel. It was a figure, no, actually it was Che Guevara. It was a figure of Che Guevara. And this was in the shop. And it caused a pretty big uproar, and I eventually had to write an editorial in the newspaper talking about, on one hand, how this was an image that was part of a commodified object, that was something that was being sold in the shop, was not in the galleries. Nonetheless, it was in our museum, and probably should not have been.
Mm-hmm. So you
removed it immediately.
Removed it. So, because, I mean, on the one hand, we're saying museums are now not just the precincts of academics and who, you know, maybe in a previous time said it's nobody's business what we put up here. We have our experts, we decide. We want to get out of that. We want to be very much community-facing institutions. But when that same community starts telling museums, we don't want to look at that, that creates a tension that maybe wasn't there before, right? So are there certain situations where you are supposed to be responsive and others when you sort of say, well,
Where are the
we
lines?
made our decision?
You know, I think that we're also working in this kind of economy of complexity. It's not, you know, one doesn't look at art, and the hardest thing to teach your docents or to welcome people into the museum and say is like, I don't have an answer. That's not a riddle. There's not a punchline. And that, you know, as Holland Cotter has been saying on his wonderful tours, it's not about trying to make it simpler. It's about trying to make it more complex. And I think that is kind of at the root of a social media, very fast-moving, polarized idea, is that we're just trying to find the fast answer, and art slows you down, and art changes, and its meaning changes over time, or even over your individual relationship to it over time. So, you know, like, we should fall back on what we really believe, which is there's not a single answer, and that's what art teaches us, and that's what we're trying to present and make available to as wide an audience as possible.
So speaking of wide audiences, you all spoken eloquently to your desire and your success in attracting a much more diverse audience to the institutions, and we're talking about three institutions that have been obviously out front in that. Nonetheless, the majority of society still doesn't go to museums. We've been spending the last decade, you know, more talking about the diversification of museum staffs as well. And despite all that, I think we can agree there's a very long way to go. So what about that segment of the audience that still doesn't feel that the doors are open for museums? What is it that could be done? What is it that museums aren't doing that they could be doing?
I think museums should acknowledge that everyone has their own intelligences and everyone has their own aesthetic choices, and not try and talk down to people when they invite them in, and when they create didactics and gallery notes, and when they speak to children and to people of different abilities, that everybody has a sense. Everybody has a sense of what they think is good, what they think is seductive, what they think is interesting, what they want to spend more time with. And in a very Freirean way, everyone comes with their own knowledge and intelligences. Just because it's not the same as mine doesn't mean it's any less.
But what do you have? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you know, I think it's important to listen actively at all times, and we can listen more actively to the world around us than we've ever been able to do because of social media and all kinds of media that can inform us of public opinion. But we've got to actively seek that opinion, and we've got to engage with the audience that we have in order to expand to the audience that we want. And we are all working on that. I think that the multidimensionality of the museum experience is the key to it. It's not one thing or the other thing. There can be all kinds of experiences, one of which you will connect with and will bring you to that place. The whole point is to bring you to a place. Even if it's a cyber place that has something to do with the programs that we produce. But the ideal is to have you in our place and to feel that you own it. And in fact, every citizen of North Carolina owns our museum equally. And I've tried to basically impart to them that they do own it. It is theirs. And they have a place there, and they can find their own way through it and their own experiences in it. And I think that's what we all want to do, is to create a healthy place, a place marked by excellence. And that's another thing museums do. They curate experiences, just as they curate art, at the highest level, and the highest level of creativity. And you know that when you go to these places, you are a part of something excellent.
I think a lot of us, we've also taken advantage of digital experience in many different ways, and using the digital as a form of establishing different contexts for even considering a work of art. And I think there's one thing for looking at what a painting might be like on the wall of the gallery versus what it might be like in a digital sphere with other apparatus around it. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is that, how do we talk about the things that are behind the work of art, right? We walk into a museum and we see lots of things when we're looking at even a painting just based upon art historical knowledge. What if you're walking in, you don't have that? How do we give some of that information? And I think the digital has been a way of fleshing that out for people, and really giving it an experience that lends itself to the idea of experience rather than the idea of simply looking at something.
One of my, I'm sure all of our good friends, local hero, Dennis Scholl, when he was at the Knight Foundation, he told me this great story, which I love telling again, about his experience. He went to, let's just say, a city in the United States that had recently completed a contemporary art museum designed by very fancy, really cool, let's just say, French architects. And he takes a cab from the airport to this museum. And the driver is a recently arrived immigrant from Haiti. And they pull up to the museum, which is super cool. Many of the people in this audience, I'm sure, have gone to that city to see that museum because of this fancy building that they built. And he asked the driver, have you ever been in there? And the driver's about, no, this is not for people like us. And then Dennis asked the question, how did this guy know? How did he know a few months after arriving that this building is not for him? I think it's a great story about a lot of the things that museums do to capture audiences and create cultural tourism and frankly appeal to more affluent people. They're sending out signals that turn other segments of the audience away, right? So what else, do you resonate with that? And do you, are there other things, do you feel that the threshold is sometimes set high? And how do you counteract that message of, oh, we're elitist, we're not for you? You're all working on that.
I mean, the analogy I use personally is that, growing up in New York City, you went to, go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You're walking up those grand stairs. You got the Greco-Roman architecture. Yeah, it means a certain thing, right? Whereas opposed to us, we're here in Miami. We have a very porous structure, which is all about glass, which is about cutting through the idea of inside and outside. You walk immediately into art, as opposed to this different type of architectural experience. And I think most of us are dealing with that, even in the way that we situate art versus how it has been in the past, when you walk directly into the space. And creating spaces architecturally that are perhaps more open to the community around us.
I'm particularly interested to, again, sort of dovetail on what Franklin's talking about in terms of architecture, to respond to your story, in creating like a welcoming carpet that extends from outside the museum and surrounds the museum, so that, getting the physical barrier of the door is one thing. But also, I think for those who are already like set to come into ICA, if there's a welcoming carpet that extends in the blocks around ICA, it also just kind of helps you make a transition into a museum from, the daily Sometimes, depending on the artwork and the artist, the experience should be very similar to our daily roles and responsibilities. But sometimes it should be something that's outside that. And I guess in terms of thinking about those barriers, we're in a specific situation because we're Kunsthalle, because we're not an encyclopedic museum. In our city, there are several encyclopedic museums. And so our mission is to go a little bit further, and I've identified our core audience is artists, and then kind of there's these concentric circles of audience. So that's who we're speaking to. We can find a way of writing, and everyone at ICA is very print-oriented, very book-heavy. We're book nerds, and we love it. But finding a way of writing that isn't dumbed down and yet isn't academic. And so hitting that tone is really what the curatorial team challenges each other to do. On the day I left, they were reading through, literally out loud, in the conference room with the curatorial team and the curatorial production team. They were reading the drafts of gallery notes aloud to each other to see. It was not a copy editing exercise. I think it was more of an interpretive exercise to find if they were hitting the right note. And also that the language was as engaging as the artwork, that the language was as beautiful and complex and interesting. And they were thinking about what's the difference of the text on the wall versus the text that you can read or take away, or the text that you're going to see on the website or in the press release. So, I mean, all of those areas are touched by the people who populate the institutions, the people who make up the institutions.
I'd like to, excuse me, I was just going to add to that. I think that reflecting on my long tenure in this field, what I realize is that every traditional behavior of museums must now be questioned. Everything that was done one way needs to be questioned, whether it's the labels or whether it's the way you mark the front door, or the way you do your marketing, your architecture. Everything needs to be questioned if it does not support an enhancement of the experience and a projection of a democratic experience for the institution. The elitist edges have to be questioned. The scholarly credentials and the scholarly behavior of the museum must be questioned. The role of the curator must be questioned. The role of the educator must be questioned. The organization of the staff must be questioned. The old ways simply do not work anymore. How do you build new teams that focus on the new values and the new character of the institution?
I'm so glad you raised that, because it actually was my next question, and we'll get to your questions in a second. You're describing a very different idea of a museum than all of you grew up with, even though you were all studied at different times. So you can't get the same results out of the same machine. There were such different results out of the same machine. So I'm curious, in your respective roles, how are you trying to rejigger the organizational mechanism to get to the result that you're aiming for? Whether you've taken any specific steps in new roles or new departments or whatever.
Well, I'll just speak a little to that. It's very difficult to lead change. Particularly, the larger the staff and the longer they've been there, the more entrenched is the behavior. And true with boards and the expectations of the community. I think as museum leaders, it is our responsibility to create that internal conversation about the need for change and the value of change. Ultimately, it's done by fiat. I mean, you just simply declare that we're just doing things differently, and we're reorganizing differently. One thing I did was basically said, the education department sits over here, and the curators sit over here, and we have this public programs division over here. We have the marketing people down the hall. Well, by golly, why don't we all come together as a team. And it's not anymore about education, it's about the program of the museum. Everything we do is about the program of the museum, and all of our programs are about our audience and about our community. And that's where the marketing position needs to be. That's where the actual creativity needs to be. And so we did away with the education department, and well, we basically made it part of the program team. And everybody works together in that regard. So it created and it changed the culture, and it changed the focus. And now that I'm gone, of course, it gives them an opportunity to go back if they want to.
Hopefully not, to build on your achievements. Anything that you're thinking about or have done in this vein inside the museum? Or you're seeing others
doing similar things. I mean, I think the idea that when you put the marketing person and the digital person and you put them in the curatorial conversation and you just put them all together, I think different things happen. And we've been trying to do a whole lot of that, even, and it is by fiat in many ways, right? And saying that, yes, this person's voice is just as important as that other voice. So we've been trying to do a whole lot of that.
Pam's received some really interesting funding, too, from the Walton and the Ford Foundation to create, like, both the pipeline for racial and ethnic inclusion in who gets to work in museums. And for me, that's a big part of what I do as the director and what is a big part of my vision. And I think it's a shared vision across the staff, the university partners, as well as our board and donors. And, you know, you have to work at every point along a hiring. You have to think about how you're recruiting and who you're recruiting with. You have to think about whether candidates of difference have equivalent experience, because they are not, because the same people who are, you know, there's the same people are coming out of art history and museum studies programs and who are populating museum work. So you have to think about recruiting talented individuals from alternative or from other fields and telling them they can do their work inside the museum, and then you need to hire them, and then you need to train them, and then you need to retain them, you know? And so how do you continue to do that? I know I am a museum director because people came before me, and, you know, I will leave the field looking a lot different than the one that I work in now. And I know that that's true of both of, you know, my panelist colleagues, but can you talk a little bit more about the PAM
well, I had Suzanne Delahanty before me, who phenomenal director of the museum, and set a tone that we try to pick up on, which is that, you know, in terms of audience, which we've talked about a lot, is that we really want to be representative of Miami. And in order to do that, that means we have to be really, really good at representing and presenting the work of Latin America and the Caribbean. So we've made that a core responsibility, and we put that in our mission statement. Like as Amy mentions, and we also have benefited from not only the research that was done several years ago by the Mellon Foundation, which suggested that if we were all to make a consideration of a diversification within the curatorial ranks, that eventually some of these conversations would change. We've already seen that. I mean, we've all alluded to that today. There is that change. Is it enough? No, probably not. And it's not only limited to race or to ethnicity, but the diversity of ideas. Where do those ideas come from? So we have a Ford Foundation fellow who's been with us for a year, who is definitely changing the conversation. I mean, the ideas are completely different. The kid is 23 years old, which is, I'd say, our average age outside within the curatorial department, and I would include myself in that conversation, which really makes it higher, is probably, you know, late 30s, 40s. So it has drastically changed the conversation. The things that this person wants to do in terms of how a person experiences the museum are definitely different than what I grew up with. We also have a Diversifying Art Museum Leadership Initiative, which is a combination of the Ford Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation. And so we have a young woman who's also with us from that program, and likewise really changing the conversation. She's there with desire to have a community-based initiative around her position. So it's not just what shows are you trying to put on, but what are you doing as far as our wider community is concerned.
We've been spending much of the week down by the beach with the artist Tomás Saraceno, and he's been throwing around this term mental ecology. We talk about our ecology in terms of the weather and in the environment, but there's a kind of mental ecology in every organization, and addressing that is a leadership challenge. I think it's time to see if a few of you have some questions to throw out at these very esteemed people. I cannot believe that nobody has a question.
It's early.
Here's one. Maybe we need some coffee, people, or early Ruinart champagne.
Hello, my name is Emilia. I come from Puerto Rico. It's more than a comment than a question. I am a college professor, and once I worked for like 3 years in a university that is in a rural area in Puerto Rico, and is very distant from San Juan and other cities. So the students are very different for most of the campus here in the United States and they're in Puerto Rico. And I organize outings to museums for them. And a lot of the times they ask me, can I come to this museum alone? Can I bring my family? Can I bring my boyfriend, my girlfriend? And I was like, wow. They don't know they can come here alone by themselves. And you were talking about this walls museum build, and how we can tear them down, and I think bringing students, bringing the community, and making these efforts so they can go at least once with us or with someone else, and then they know they can go by themselves and they can bring their communities and their families, etc. And I think there can be another initiatives. Once I was thinking about we can maybe have like a very not expensive restaurant inside museums, so people from the community around or people who work around the museum need to go there because it's a lot less expensive than other restaurants around. So they feel obligated to go into the museum, and then they can, tear the wall down again.
Or because we have gender-neutral bathrooms, or because we have a place where you can fill your water bottle, or do you know what Vasif was doing at SALT in Istanbul, putting a cash machine in the lobby of the museum just to draw people in. And it's like, hey, if you want to go see the shows, you can, but at least you stepped in. Thanks for the work you're doing. It's nice to know, too, that, the country mouse can become a city mouse, and that people in rural areas are also cosmopolitan and are hungry for rich cultural experiences. And it reminds me of a story of running into one of my great donors, Roy Jones, in the Jeremy Deller exhibition that Kate Craxton also was the receiving curator of. And in the Battle of Ogrive, I don't know how we started talking in the room, but he told me that he had been a coal miner, and then he was a union organizer for the coal miners, and that the union taught him. This is a person that went on to go to Oxford, Cambridge, and become this international lawyer, but he was educated through the coal mining union in the UK, and they would put them on a bus and drive them in and take them to, all of the great London museums, and that's where he became interested in art. And so that was an education that they were doing with the coal miners and with the coal miners' families and their children's, and it's incredible.
Let's not forget that, in fact, there is now this sort of stereotype of the old elitist museum. Many of museums, including the Victoria and Albert in London, were specifically created to get the working class in. There's a long story around that. Anybody else? There's a question there, and there's a question there. So let's start over there, the lady.
Hi, I studied video art and fine arts, and I'm a video editor now. And I like how we're talking about all the wonderful tactile experiences for people, personal, upfront experiences to go to the museum and have access. But I was wondering if we could divulge more into like the social media aspect, because I went into like the MoMA's channel on YouTube and I saw some videos that were kind of like interesting, but in my opinion maybe just, I don't know, could use a little bit more updating in its style and things like that. So like, could we just like, I don't know, talk about more about like how we can, you know, create that more accessibility with the internet and social media, because it's so different. Like their ideas are so, the experience is so different, you know, with advertisements and going to the museum and stuff.
So how can you use digital media to create access?
Hire more artists to edit the videos in the museum, which is what we just did, and that's why our social media is looking really cool because of Ali. Yeah.
We're doing the same thing.
What she said. Okay, over there.
Yes. I wanted to go back to the issue that came up at the beginning about museums being political institutions no matter what, whereas you try or not try to be political. And then as we move the conversation into the idea that the museum needs to be a space for everyone. You know, you have a constituent, you have a Miami audience, you have North Carolina audiences. Nevertheless, you know, there is this idea that has been mentioned several times in the panel, but we can't be, you know, we're not political. So there is a level of political and a level of not political, which is translated as being non-partisan. But at the same time, you know, I think of myself, I am a curator, and I consider myself a fairly political person because I am a critical person of patriarchy, I'm a feminist person, I am for minority artists and so forth. So, but how can you actually really truly strike that? Because if you know that you are in a place where the audience is profoundly, you know, there is a profound racism, let's say North Carolina, even, you know, the prejudice that exists. I lived in Miami and I worked for a while, you know, this whole kind of historical tension in relation to Cuba, or for example, or now this situation with migration, and, you know, this reignition of control of the body, for example, of women. So how can you truly embrace everybody and be non-political or pretend not to be non-political when you know that, let's say, if you have the Kehinde Wiley, you know, painting, you're going to offend a bunch of people and people are going to hate you for that, at least half of them. So how does this democracy really work?
Well, yes, we are political in the sense that we represent artists who voice through their creativity their sense of the issues of the day. So artists are dealing with immigration, and artists are dealing with race, and artists are dealing with the issues about the environment. And what museums do is they honor these voices and bring them together and curate conversations. In that sense, it's political. I put it, in my sense of politics in North Carolina, because I am governed by the state of North Carolina and their elected representatives and their governor, and there are Democrats and there are Republicans. In that sense, we are nonpartisan. We do not take a political position that favors one set of principles over another set of partisan principles. But in terms of the politics of society and the world we're in, yes, we have a responsibility to reflect that.
So as museum leaders, and as cultural workers and as artists, we're not just cultural workers, we're civic actors and we're civic leaders. And I think that one way that ICA and under my direction has been explicit about its political stance, to say that it's a feminist museum. I've been asked by journalists and academics and artists too, like, what does that mean? You know, to say that we're an anti-racist museum. And so you just say those things explicitly. It's not, justice isn't partisan necessarily, but, you know, if you don't agree with that, then I'm telling you that's where I'm coming from. My staff is saying that's where the institution is coming from. And the artists understand that as well. Is all of the work going to look like it's political work? Not necessarily. But is the space itself moving towards representing both a cultural and a civic mission? Yes.
I would
I don't know
agree.
if that's an answer.
Yeah, no, I would agree with both of you, and it is a balance between representing a civic institution and also a cultural institution, and that recognizing that we have this seat at that table, and being a part of the conversation along with political representatives, recognizing that we do have a board, in my case, of almost 50 people, who are members of a civic community and want to have a voice in that community. I think it's an opening up of a democratic space, and that implies a certain level of politics, but at the same time, it is more of a creating that space for those conversations to happen. Mm-hmm. So it's hard not to say like you're getting both ways, but I think that's what we're trying to do. Right, we're trying to advocate for a vision of a world that we believe in, and at the same time recognizing that we are a part of a much bigger apparatus and wanting to play that role.
And that democracy is really impacted by improvisation and experimentation, and that those are hallmarks of contemporary and of great and interesting and worthwhile art. And so we build that by providing opportunities to experience the experimental and the improvisational.
Well, I'm really glad we are here. I'm going to let you guys go in a few minutes, but not before asking them one last question. But I do think that what our conversation, which is speaking of improvisation, we've sort of jumped around a lot of issues, but I think if one thing has come through, is that although the things we're discussing are very, very challenging and often put directors in front of tough decisions, it's also created a tremendous opportunity for museums to reinvent themselves and make themselves vital to society in a way that, frankly, perhaps they weren't before. So although this is a treacherous and tough road, it's putting museums more in the center of society, at least the museums that want to take on that role. And we have three very intrepid leaders here today. So I want to end on one last question that just takes us back to where we started, which is this issue of political polarization, people in different corners speaking to themselves, and what museums can do to stake out a place in the middle for dialogue. So you've mentioned a couple of foundations already, but let's just hypothetically imagine that a new foundation comes along, and this is a foundation that is very interested in creating genuine dialogue across the full political spectrum, ideological spectrum of this country. And they are coming to museums like yourselves, and they're prepared to give you a significant amount of money, maybe $1 million, to do something. And they don't care what you do. You can do a publication, you can acquire work, you can do an inexpensive restaurant in the middle of your... the only thing is, like many foundations, they're super into measurement. They're going to measure what's happening, and they want to see objective proof that at the end of this experiment, you have succeeded in getting people together. What would you propose? Let's start with Larry and end up over there.
What would I propose as my grant application?
Exactly.
Oh, Lordy. There's so much. I don't know. I think that there are just so many possibilities. Not that I have to struggle to come up with something, but to come up with one thing that enhances the conversation and brings people together. I think I've done some of that. I guess to explore what's missing. The more we do, the more there is to do, and what are those sets of priorities that will reshape the museum of the future. But I would probably do something about a community forum, about bringing voices together to explore relevance and how the museum can what is relevance in our society today in the place of cultural expression, and how can we do better? That's the thing I'm
Okay.
thinking.
Franklin?
So we have the Knight Foundation here in Miami, and of course in other cities, 26 total cities, but really hardcore in Philadelphia and Akron and here in Detroit. And we're basically posed this question almost every day by Alberto Ibargüen, who's the director of the foundation, and also Victoria Rogers, who's his lead arts programmer. And I think, and so when we opened 5 years ago in our new building, the Pérez, after being in downtown in a much smaller space, the idea was that we needed to do something in terms of, and I think all of us are driving toward audience engagement in some way. We needed to do something around acknowledging the beginnings of a conversation around African American art in this city in particular, right? It had already been happening, but we needed to double down on it. And so what they did was they said, okay, we're gonna go in with George Pérez, here's $1 million. Go out and get whatever you want. So in the process, we went out and bought 14 different amazing works of art, spent that down, and then recognized that what happens when you have a different group of people at the table. So we stopped, and we decided to bring it back to over $1.5 million. It's now an endowment. It'll be there forever. Mm-hmm. So that's one instance of how that works. And what it did was it said to a wide swath of people, it said, you are represented here visually, we care about you, and we want you here. And I think that's what we're always trying to do. What I would do with the $1 million right now is, and actually it just came in last week, is that we're going to get a curator of actual digital. So somebody who's sitting at the table, as we've talked about, with the same level of, let's say, power to determine what we look like. What do we look like, not only in terms of the first picture you see when you walk in the door, but what do we look like across the world on our app or on the website? Mm-hmm. That's what I would do.
So Larry's doing a community forum. Franklin is hiring a digital curator. How are you going to spend the grant?
I feel like I just wrote this grant application like 10 times over. It would probably go, and I would make it an endowment. I would ask to endow it. I don't know how to answer your measure question, or I'm going to avoid that. But it would probably be to support artists and artist residencies in Philadelphia. So bringing the artists to do research in Philadelphia, and really meet with people across the city. Depending on what their interests were and their projects were, both the audiences and the artists, to tap into the partnerships that we have been building over time and in depth with political, social, cultural organizations in Philadelphia and the greater Philadelphia area. And ICA is the first wage certified museum, so that $1 million would be towards artists honoraria and writers honoraria and research fees, and I would probably spend some of that on my catalog so that I could have more writers and artists in dialogue, and pay them for their work, for their labor. And I think the idea of being able to extend ICA further into the city would really depend on artist research if they wanted to take up public works that we could use that money. So this is now like $6 million, right?
Yeah. Don't worry, it's hypothetical. You can have all the money you want. But
your foundation, your imaginary foundation is so generous.
He's
Thank
amazing.
you.
She's amazing. Listen, I think where we start, we have a complex, polarized, difficult reality. But luckily, as these last answers showed, we also have a very diverse toolkit in today's museum to address that reality. And with that comforting thought, I'd like to thank all three of you for your thoughts, your candor, and thank you all for coming here today. Enjoy the show.